Welcome to my presentation on elicitation techniques. Today we will be covering laddering. We are going to go over when it was created as well as what it is used for, how to do it, the upsides, the downsides, as well as some data that was collected through using the laddering technique. To begin with, laddering is the search for core rationale. The whole purpose behind laddering is to find the core object that causes people to do things or to think a certain way. It was developed by Dennis Hinkle back in 1965, and it tries to get as in-depth as possible. It searches for virtues, which are reasons for which the person does something. These aren't necessarily things such as loyalty, love, passion, but those could be included. They are more things that cause the person to do the things they want. Depending on the situation, a virtue could be something quite mundane or worldly, or it could be one of the previous mentioned virtues such as loyalty or something that causes them to do what they want to do. So, how do we ladder? Laddering is essentially recursive questioning. We start off by asking a general question about something that we want to know, such as why did someone decide to attend BYU Idaho? And then we listen closely to their question and we follow up with a question that continues the conversation. For example, if someone said they came to BYU Idaho because the cost is low, we could follow up by asking them, why is the cost being low important to you when finding a college to go to? The conversation would then repeat until the interviewee is unable to answer well or a virtue is reached. The virtue being reached is up to the discretion of the interviewer, and that takes great skill to learn when the interviewer needs to stop and when they need to continue going. Quite often what happens as the person is being interviewed is they begin rephrasing themselves. That's also a cutoff point where they need to stop the interview and continue on to the next question. So the upside to laddering includes discovering the core reason of why people do what they do or want what they want or feel the way they feel. It's important to understand this core reasoning so that we can develop upon it and use that to our advantage. However, the core rationale that is retrieved from the laddering technique is not the only thing that is important. All the answers along the way can be useful. We can learn that a person desires to go somewhere that is cheap but also has good education, and the relationship between the two and how important each one is compared to each other. It can also be used as part of other techniques. It's very useful to sit down in a more casual or formal interview and use it as kind of a startup question to kind of feel out how the person is and to understand them a little bit better. It's also quite quick. A single question can yield a lot of data in a relatively short amount of time, and it's quite easy to learn how to do. We just have to sit down and start talking about the reason why. However, the laddering also has some downsides. Some people find it quite annoying. The interviewer is quite often asking why, and this redundant questioning can cause people to become frustrated and defensive. The interviewer must practice in order to avoid annoying the people they are interviewing. Interviews also quite often use redundant or useless data. As the person is questioning the person, they quite often end up saying the same things, and some of the data that is gained is identical to other data and isn't super useful. It also results in people giving their first thought instead of in-depth, real feelings in the beginning. And sometimes that leads you down a path that isn't necessarily the core reason of why they want to do something. This technique is also dependent on what the interviewee gives to the interviewer. No matter how good the opening question the interviewer uses, the interviewee can still ruin the technique by not giving the interviewer enough information to continue climbing up and learning more about the interviewee. Laddering is also quite difficult to master. It's very hard to see when you ought to stop and what topic should be further explored to reach the core real reasoning behind why someone does something. Now, in order to learn more about this technique, I went about and interviewed 5 different people studying here at BYU Idaho and tried to get their opinions on different things. That way I could kind of see how interviewing using the laddering technique worked, and I could also gain some data for the project at the same time. So I presented myself, as someone who's trying to develop an app, specifically our periodic table app, and I asked them what would be helpful in a study help. I also asked them as a secondary question, how would they feel about using the game, such as memory, to learn a subject, and what elements would be important for that game to successfully work. So I interviewed 5 people. 3 of them had positive results. 1 was rather technical and 1 was negative. We're mostly going to focus on the positive and negative people, but just to give a brief overview of the technical, he more focused on the UI and the interface and thought it was important that everything would be clear and concise as they use the application. So for the positive data, there were 3 primary cores. Core 1 was visuals. They wanted to be able to connect information to pictures or graphs and memorize where that location was so that they can more easily visualize it in their head and use it during tests or other times where they would need to use that information. Core 2 was repetition. They want to be able to go over things several times in order to really imprint that information into their mind. That way they wouldn't have any doubts about what they were learning and they'd be able to put it to real use. Core 3 was vocab. They said that this was the basis of learning. Without knowing what something is, they find it hard to learn about and they aren't able to communicate and express what they need to learn without first knowing what something is called or ways to express themselves. Now for the negative data, some people mentioned that they had a distaste for certain activities. Specifically, one person said that the game memory makes them upset. This has to do with core 2, which is that not everyone learns the same way. Not everything is universal. Some people prefer to learn visually, other people prefer to just stare at a book and pray that it, through some way, gets absorbed into their brain through their eyes. Not everything works for everyone, and so when designing an app, one has to consider different ways that different people learn and try to make it as available to everyone as possible. Thank you guys so much for watching my presentation on laddering. I hope you guys learned something, and I hope you guys are able to employ laddering as we search for ways to do this project.